Iran's Islamist rulers have been slaughtering Iranian citizens by the thousands. They've also been waging a cognitive war, a disinformation campaign. Call it what you like. Al Jazeera, the media platform owned and operated by Qatar's rulers, who are Muslim Brotherhood supporters, has contributed to this propaganda effort. That may not surprise you. What might? Wikipedia is also aiding and abetting the mass murderers. No one knows more about Wikipedia's efforts to whitewash Iranian human rights abuses, expunge pro-democracy sources, and glorify regime killers than Ashley Rindsberg. He's joining us today. You are too. I'm Cliff May, and we're all here together on Foreign Policy. Ashley, good to see you. Really a pleasure.
Thank you, Cliff. You too.
Now, you've been on this podcast before. I think the last time was after you wrote a book about the New York Times, my alma mater, called The Gray Lady Winked. And I think I wrote a blurb for it. But maybe just start by telling listeners who didn't hear that episode a bit about who you are and how you became what I would say is a very rare bird, an investigative reporter who reports on the media itself. Actually, I can't think of anybody else who does what you do or really even attempts to. I mean, most so-called media critics are mainly media cheerleaders. They quibble, nothing more. So anyway, a bit about yourself. Start with that.
Sure. I wrote a book about the New York Times back in the day. I never intended to do that. It wasn't something I set out to do in life. It was something that came to me as I was reading The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer.
Classic.
And came across this little footnote where he said that as hostilities broke out in Europe in World War II, the New York Times, in its lead story of the day, had this claim that that Poland had invaded Germany, and that's what kicked things off. And I did a double take with that, and I went and looked through the archive. I found that story, and it did say that, and I was quite shocked. So I started to dig in a little bit more, and try to understand what happened there and like how they could get to that point. That what turned out was that was an operation run by the Nazis. It was called Operation Himmler, and it was designed to fool the media, fool the Western media, and into thinking that Polish guerrilla fighters had invaded Germany and killed a bunch of people in a radio station, and that gave Hitler enough pretext to stage his blitzkrieg into Poland, which is what he did. So my question became, how many times has this happened at the New York Times where they just got something so epically wrong that it actually kind of influenced the course of history? And that became the book, The Gray Lady Wing.
And I want to get to the modern day, but I'm curious to know, what was it that the Times correspondent, I guess in Berlin, who reported that was duped? Or was it more that he was sympathetic, or is no way to know at this point what the story was?
Yeah, there's no byline on that particular story, if I remember correctly. So it could have been a dupe. At the time, though, the guy running the Berlin bureau for the New York Times was a known Nazi sympathizer. And when the Nazis actually came and rounded up all the American reporters in Germany after war was declared between Germany and the United States, this was the one guy who was allowed to stay in his posh hotel in Berlin. And there's a memo from a Nazi higher up, a Nazi officer, saying it was because of his proven friendliness towards Germany that he was allowed to stay. All the other American reporters were rounded up and they were sent to the countryside. They were under SS guard in this like frozen chateau. It used the word chateau. It sounds nice. From their description, it was cold, broken down. There wasn't enough food. They were under armed guard. But Guido Enderis, who's the name of the New York Times Berlin bureau chief, who the Nazi sympathizer, was allowed to enjoy life in Berlin. So there was some sympathy. If you look at some of the reporting at the time, it's very, very troubling. I mean, even without a critical eye, even just on the surface of it, proclaiming the Nazi Olympics, the Berlin Olympics, the greatest sporting event of all time in the headline. And you could say like, well, they were kind of like, everyone was just kind of wowed by this. But when you read other reporters like William Shire about the same
Yeah.
events, they tell a completely different story, and you didn't have to think that way. It was a choice. So that was the Gray Lady Winked, and that kind of got me more into writing about media. COVID was raging at that moment, and that became a big topic for me, and trying to understand how the media was reporting on COVID, particularly the origin of the virus, and looking at how a lot of the messaging from the media, the New York Times and the Washington Post in particular, really lined up, not just in terms of the content of the messaging, but also the timing with what China Daily was putting out in the early days about the lab leak being a racist theory, being xenophobic.
Mm.
This was coming straight out of China Daily before the Washington Post and the New York Times were printing the same thing. So those are parallels that I found very alarming in a way, and the rest of the COVID reporting, and that got me back into sort of the reporting swing, and here we are talking about what's going on
Well,
online and not just offline.
and just to get up to date, you're the founder and chief investigative officer of NPOV, which I think is Neutral Point of View, and I think that's an organization you founded when last October, right?
Yeah, it was about then, last October. So the idea was that not a lot of people, I'm not actually sure if anybody is doing this kind of investigative reporting into the platforms and the influence networks that are active in coordination, to, to propagandistic ends, or whatever it might be, ideological, it could be business interests. But this stuff is happening all around us, and I think a lot of people kind of have an intuition when they're on the platform of their choice. If people are out there on X or they're on Facebook and they're seeing stuff, they're just like, this just looks too determined. It's too steady of a drumbeat, and
Mm,
there's too much
mm.
of it going on at the same time for it to be normal. But they don't really know why that would be or how that would work. And that's the kind of thing that I really try to investigate and try to bring that to the surface, how that does work, how these groups do coordinate, and what their objectives are, and what their ideological motivations are. And once you look, because a lot of the information is out there, there's records of these things, you start to see a different kind of pattern.
I mean, it's an interesting odd thing because the fact of the internet, the fact that we have at our on our phones access to so many sources should make us all better informed, not smarter, but less ignorant, all of that. But the opportunity for us to be deluded, for us to be indoctrinated, is actually larger than it perhaps ever been. And your mission at NPOV, I guess, is to look at various sources that are doing that mostly online. Is that fair? Is that how you describe it,
Yeah,
or maybe you can do it better than that?
yeah. To look at major platforms, major digital platforms, and look at influence networks that are active on them, that are coordinating, and that are, often case this is state aligned. It may not be state backed. There are indications of state backed activity with China, for example. A lot of it is aligned with foreign terror organizations. So we've seen that on Reddit with regard to Hamas. A lot of Hamas activity and Hamas alignment on messaging, on topic, on tactic. And then there's, this is something actually I haven't begun to look into as much yet, but there is Russian activity, of course. It's the Russian MO, which is a shame to say it, because the Democrats and the media, their activity with Russiagate sort of poisoned the well. It's hard to talk about Russia today seriously as spreading what the center left would like to call misinformation, disinformation. It's basically propaganda, agitprop.
Mm.
It's very still rooted in Soviet tactics and strategies and how they do this stuff. They just took it from out of Pravda printed newspaper and put it onto Twitter or onto Reddit. But that's all still going on. Anyone with an interest, with any kind of geopolitical interest, would naturally have an overwhelming interest to devote some resource to these platforms, because it's not that expensive. It's highly leveraged, and the outcomes can be enormous. If you're able to change a narrative on Wikipedia, which feeds into Google and which feeds into AI, you're able to change not just like a record of history, but a record of the present, which is basically reality. So these people know this. They're paying attention, and they know how to run these operations. They have the resources to do it. So you can pretty much guarantee that all of them are.
I'm going to come back to some of what you said and have let you unpack it at greater length, but talk for a minute about. I mean, we've had a really serious uprising in Iran, and we believe it's thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Iranian protesters who are opposed. I think not just. I mean, are opposed to living under Islamist rule, which has been incompetent, which has been oppressive in every way, and the regime has shut down the internet as we record this. I think it's still shut down, but you've been seeing a lot of, I think, propaganda from the regime getting into major sources of major media sources. Do I have that right?
I've been looking at pro-Iranian regime editing on Wikipedia,
Okay.
which there's a lot of. Some of it overlaps with the pro-Hamas or
Yeah,
the like stridently
for
anti-Israel
sure.
stuff. There's some editors that really interested in both topics, not surprisingly. Um, I think from a media standpoint, it's very interesting. Sometimes these things can get a little overblown on X when people say the media didn't cover this, media didn't cover that. In this case, I'm actually quite astounded that there was coverage. You just can't ignore something this potentially momentous and brutal. But when I look at it and you just think, you compare the coverage of Minnesota, which is deep in the weeds, and there's people on the ground, and there's podcasts, and there's investigative task forces, and you just don't see anything like that. Not to say that people could get on the ground in Iran today, but you could very easily do the human interest stuff, be interviewing lots of people with family members
Yeah,
who are trapped in
yeah.
Iran. You'd be doing deep dive analysis into how they control the internet. We don't really get that kind of stuff that really unpacks these types of stories the way the New York Times would do, or did do in the case of Gaza, for example, where it's just absolute saturation for years on end. You didn't even reach that peak of saturation for a single day with regard to the Iranian stuff.
Well, I mean, part of what you had here that was different from Gaza is, and yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm right on this. The BBC would simply take figures from local authorities, from the Gaza Health Ministry. All of this was just Hamas propaganda, and they were swallowing it whole. Whereas here they're saying, well, it's very hard for us to verify, to confirm. We don't know. There are reports, but in other words, when it's bad for the regime in Iran, they're very persnickety, very scrupulous about not taking propaganda. But that was not the case, of course, in Gaza. As they took propaganda from Hamas, then they would say, the Israelis who would say, well, we'll check on this. It's a whole news cycle or two before they can say that never happened. We didn't hit that hospital. Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket we have verified did, and then it gets a footnote. You know what I'm talking about. It's just a very much of a double standard here.
Yeah, and I did this story about the Uyghur coverage or lack of coverage about the Uyghurs
The Uyghurs, just so
by
people understand, we're talking about Turkic Muslims in what's called Xinjiang. They would call it Eastern Turkestan. It's interesting because if you look at a map, you can easily see it's not part of China. It is a possession of China north of Tibet, part of the Chinese Empire, but not part of China any more than Tibet is part of China. Okay, just so people get it, they would know what we're talking.
Yeah, right, and they've undergone a systemic brutalization, a genocide, rounded up and put into literal concentration camps. There's widespread organ harvesting by the Chinese government of the Uyghurs, like the worst of the worst kind of thing. And I did some coverage about this and the lack of media coverage and New York Times coverage. And someone, a reporter from I think Axios or something, publicly pushed back on it, saying this was, like, how can they get people on the ground? It's so restricted, et cetera, et cetera. But, you look at the same thing with Gaza. There was no one on the ground in Gaza. Like, you couldn't be on the ground as a reporter in Gaza unless you were either embedded with the IDF or working with Hamas, which many were. But that didn't stop the media from doing that kind of saturation level coverage all the time, because they can divvy it up, as you know, so many different ways. There's so many ways to tell the story, even without the on the ground stuff. But that didn't happen. And we're seeing that in real time again with the Iranian stuff, you're just not seeing that, like, this being turned into this massive arc of a story, which it is, because this is about the entire Middle East. It's about the world. It's about the linkage between Iran and Russia and China and Venezuela, and that story is just being completely washed out, unfortunately. But it's still going on, and what you pointed out to earlier is that on online on Wikipedia and probably on other platforms, but what I've been covering recently was the pro Iranian regime coverage on Wikipedia, the editors who are working to advance the interests of Iran, the government of Iran, through editing, coordinated editing, removing stuff that's unfavorable to them, whitewashing. We can go into a little bit more detail, but that's basically what I've been seeing.
Right. So let's start with what happened to Wikipedia, because it was supposed to be neutral and crowdsourced. That's an encyclopedia, and that's not the way it's turned out, as you discovered and revealed.
Yeah. Yeah, Wikipedia was. I think there was always elements of what we're seeing today. I mean, Wikipedia. It's kind of like who was naturally drawn to the platform early days, and that would have been people they were academic. They were. It started actually in Florida, but they quickly moved to the Bay Area, to San Francisco. So you have San Francisco academic. It doesn't require a leap of faith to think that that demographic would be left leaning or left wing full
The
blown, and they
demographic
were.
who creates, writes, edits, not that.
Yeah,
Okay,
editors,
yeah,
right, exactly. So the editors tend to be much more on that kind of scale, that side of things. And as the culture developed on the platform among the editors and among the admins who make decisions about what content stays and goes and which editor gets banned or doesn't get banned, you developed an institutional culture, and that culture became more and more left. At some point around 2016, when we opened up this sort of vacuum about fake news, because then Hillary Clinton, after losing the election, goes in front of Congress weeks after the election saying we are facing a fake news epidemic. This is something that Obama codifies, like um, various tools into law that they were going to use to fight this fake news epidemic. The notion was that Russia had swung the election to Trump through using Facebook somehow. It wasn't fully explained how that happened. Turns out it didn't happen. But into this vacuum of information and instability, Wikipedia says they identify a strategic opportunity to remake themselves as a platform. So they shift their mission. This is something called the movement strategy, and it was led by Catherine Maher, who's now the CEO of NPR. She became the executive director of Wikipedia at that time, and she brings in a lot of former Hillary Clinton aides and a lot of Soros World executives and people from Open Society foundations, and they changed the mission of Wikipedia and the Wikimedia Foundation from building an online encyclopedia and opening information to everybody to becoming what they call a essential knowledge infrastructure. They call it global knowledge infrastructure, dedicated in part to advancing a DEI mission, which they describe as knowledge equity.
knowledge
And
equity.
yeah, and this is really becoming Wikipedia becoming a social justice movement at the end of the day, in broad strokes. So between these two forces, the culture of the platform already being solidly left, and then Wikimedia Foundation undergoing this really significant transformation in 2016-17, you have a remaking of the site that also coincides with the beginning of online information wars really ramping up to a significant degree, where actors like Russia and actors like China and Iran and everybody else start to see these platforms as being extremely valuable and very easy. You
Mm.
don't need you don't need to jump through hoops. Unlike, say what we want about the mainstream media, but like you at least need to convince an editor or two that this story is worth running and that it's accurate. On Wikipedia, you don't need that. You just need enough coordinated editors to push the same ideas and to back each other up in a clever way. And you can print or you can publish there just about anything you want if you are sophisticated about it.
Well, I mean, A couple of things I don't understand. I think of them as all working remote, but they say you said they moved from Florida to San Francisco area. Do they have offices? They have a big building. They have a small building with the
Yeah,
full-time staff.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah. They started out very small,
Uh-huh.
back in the Florida days. That was in 2001, and it grew like wildfire. Because they hit on this idea. It was partly Larry Sanger, partly some other people there, of taking this idea of a wiki, which is a website anybody could edit without having like an admin permission, and marrying it with the concept of a encyclopedia, and just it took off really fast.
And so, could I say, okay, I fancy myself a national security expert, former foreign correspondent. I want to write for Wikipedia or edit for Wikipedia. Can I just do it?
You can technically create an account, or you don't even actually have to create an account. You don't have to register an account. Um, and you could try to write something. The chances that your edit is actually going to stick are extremely, extremely low. You know, approaching zero, especially on a contentious issue topic like anything geopolitical or anything related to foreign policy. You will be defeated. You will make mistakes, procedural mistakes that you don't know about. People will come with these, they call it rules lawyering. It's very parliamentary, like how they can pull out guidelines, rules, principles, essays that they would make a case that what your edit is inappropriate, it violated this and violated that, and then two or three of their friends would come in and say the same thing, and an admin would then make some decision. You personally would just give up before you even got to the middle of the fight. Well, they'll just fight it out until they win. So in practice, no. If you did that in 2001 or 2002 when it was very early, yeah, you probably could have established that as a topic area where your username would be known in. And that kind of cuts to the point, is that the older accounts, the accounts that were there from the beginning or early on, accrued a lot more social credibility or
Mm.
clout on the site, and that gives them power. So you have this deepening effect of the institutional capture going back to the early days of the platform, and then coupling it with Wikimedia Foundation's own swerve into social justice. And it is very closed out again, unless you're extremely, either have this like, I just love rules, and I love, people, a lot of people, insiders talk about like that there seem to be a predominance of I wouldn't people on the spectrum who are really drawn to Wikipedia and they really enjoy it and they don't mind learning all the rules and applying all the rules and just spending hours and hours and hours on day alone in a room typing. Like, they really like that. If you're not that, I don't think there's much chance, unless you're like professionally trained or something. But I don't know how that works.
Do you know how much of the staff, how many staffers are paid, compensated staffers, and how many of the contributors are purely volunteers and this is their hobby and that they've gotten into? Do you have any idea?
So technically speaking, nominally speaking, all the editors are volunteer editors, aside from no, they're all volunteer editors. There are no paid. There's no paid editing on the site theoretically. In reality, there's a lot of paid editing on the site. It doesn't run through Wikipedia itself. It runs through dozens, if not hundreds, of like marketing agencies
Hmm.
that are paid. Some of them are sort of quote unquote above board. They disclose that they're there and that they're doing this, and they have a conflict of interest. And these guys are paid by Pfizer, by the New York Times, by NBC Universal's engaged these guys. Defense Department officials have done it, to sort of clean up their Wikipedia entries and get them more on brand. Some of it is behind the scenes, which is illicit, and they're called black hat editors. But what is theoretically supposed to be the case is that all the editors are volunteers. At Wikimedia Foundation, the NGO, they have an enormous staff. They have a $200 million budget. They raise about that much money per
When you
year. They
say
have
enormous staff, like give me a ballpark.
they have, let's say, 400 engineers and product people, and they have an executive team of 8 to 10, sort of CTO level, COO, CEO type, chief advancement officers. And then there's probably a bunch of fundraising people that I haven't counted. So I can't imagine it being really much less than 500 people in the organization.
Pay 500 people. That's more than $2 or $3 million budget, I would think. If they're
200.
$200 million a year budget.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, 180 maybe. It's a little under
Well, that's
200. Yeah,
huge. That's huge. Huge.
it's
$180
huge.
million
It's
a
huge.
year. Now, they also said they're an
Yes.
NGO. If they have fundraisers. Now that so, talk a little bit about who's funding them, because it's probably not some ant in Minneapolis sending in $20 that gets you to 180 million a year budget.
Yeah. So the budget breaks down. There is a lot of small donation, and the reason they can fund at the small donation level is because basically of Google. So Google, when you do a search on Wikipedia, on Google for almost anything, unless it's like like some kind of Patagonia
Yeah.
scarf or something that's like not going to be on Wikipedia. But if it's anything topic related, the very first result is almost always going to be a Wikipedia entry. That means, we all kind of know this idea of SEO and the amount of money that companies will pay to get that top spot in Google. They just get it automatically from Google. So they're getting billions of dollars worth of SEO value. And what that means for them is
Search
that they
engine
have this.
optimization, SEO, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. So they get this enormous, enormous flow of traffic that
Huh.
comes via Google onto Wikipedia. And what you see on Wikipedia all the time, people complain about this, is the banners that are asking for money. So that you get to them, there's going to be a banner saying,
Right.
please don't scroll. Then you're going to get a pop up, and you're going to get more and more and more and more and more. And even if just a tiny, tiny fraction of all that enormous traffic is giving to them, that's a lot of money. So that's one piece of it. Another piece of it is you have institutional donors, you have big name donors. So they, around the time that I described where they undergo this shift, the movement strategy in 2016, 17, they also launch an endowment. So very similar to university style endowment. And the goal was to raise $100 million in 6 years, I think,
This is Wikipedia's goal, is to raise that money. Yeah.
as for an
And
endowment.
for an
Yeah, so that
endowment.
would
Yeah,
be
I'd love to have an
separate from the.
endowment, right? That I've a couple of $100 million. I know that FDD can budget and plan for the next 10 years without any difficulty. Right.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. I love the idea.
Exactly. Right. So separate from your operational budget, like you get this huge endowment. Um, so they did this really weird thing with the endowment, which is they nested it inside of Tides Foundation. Tides being the far left activist foundation, social justice fund and foundation, $1 billion.
Right.
Um,
Right. John Kerry's wife, Teresa Hines, was behind that at one point, and maybe she's not now. But yes, the Tides is a left wing grant making foundation. I'm familiar with it. They don't give any money to FDD, right? Just so full
um, So, a very strange decision for an existing, long-standing NGO, right? We're not talking about some little nonprofit that started up yesterday and needs to like piggyback on another NGO to take money. We're talking about Wikimedia Foundation, been around for 20 years, but they still take their endowment and they put it inside of Tides Foundation to raise the $100 million, because Tides Foundation is a donor advised fund, which means they don't need to have donors disclosing where the money is going to. It acts as this like little blurred out, grayed out space that you can put the money into, but then no one knows where the money's going out
So they have,
from it.
yeah, donors give it to Tides, but the donors know where Tides is likely to give it. Yeah, okay.
The donors know, but nobody else
Okay,
does.
okay, right, right. You
So,
can't prove it. Right,
so
right.
at this same time that they put the endowment inside of Tides, Google starts donating enormous sums. And this is all in the same period we're talking about, 2016, 17, 2017, 18, 19. Google, which had never really it had never really done big sums of donations. It had done, $1 million, $2 million, starts giving Tides Foundation those 3 years something like, I think one year was 50, one year was 70, one year was 90. It ends up being something like just around $200 million. At that moment, Wikimedia Foundation comes out and announces we hit our $100 million target that we were aiming for 6 years. We got it in 3 years, right? 4 years or whatever it was. So, you can sort of do the math and like infer for yourself. maybe that money went from Google, which donated for the first time ever to Tides, and Wikimedia puts this fund inside of Tides and then accomplishes their massive goal in a very short amount of time.
So Google executives must know they're supporting Wikipedia, which is no longer neutral and crowdsourced. They're smart, but has been ideologically captured and now has something I think you've called the gasp worldview. You should just explain what
Yeah.
the gasp worldview is.
Yeah. So that's Larry Sanger, the co-founder of Wikipedia. He released a bunch of essays last year called the 9 Theses, and in one of there are 9 different essays about what's gone wrong at Wikipedia and what's going wrong. And one of them, he talks about the sort of the capture, the cultural capture, the worldview capture of Wikipedia, and he calls it GASP, which is global, academic, secular, and progressive.
Mm.
And I mean, I think that pretty much gets it. When you're looking at the predominant culture on Wikipedia, the worldview, that's it. Where Google, when we think about Google 2016, 17, we're coming off the Obama era. It was an era of a lot of faith put into liberal ideals, and people really kind of were invested in it, and it all worked, and it all looked and sounded really good. And Google had been a partner with Wikipedia for a long time, not just because Wikipedia benefited from all, the way I described before, but Google benefited tremendously from this relationship. Because if you're a Google user early days, and Google wasn't always what it is now, it wasn't always the behemoth and the monopoly. They were building towards that. But if you're a Google user and you type in a search about some, I don't know, whatever is interesting to you, mathematics, how hurricanes work, dog breeds, and you get a bunch of junk, you're kind of going to be like, well, this is not good for me. I'm going to go to any other search engine. But if you get this really nice encyclopedia article, and not just on one or two topics, but on literally every conceivable topic out there reliably, that's going to be the first thing you see is a neutral looking, verified seeming, high quality piece of content, nicely structured, no ads in the content. You're going to put a lot of trust in that. And you're going to therefore put the trust into Google to bring you really good search results. So this was a symbiosis for many, many years. And that's how we get to this point. Google had embraced the very same GASP worldview that Wikipedia does. Sergey Brin and Larry Page are, epochal, epic level entrepreneurs. Amazing. There's nothing, they built something just tremendously great. But that was the worldview that they came from and the worldview that they embraced. I don't know if that's still the case. And that's how this all kind of shaped up together into one thing, into this kind of big, gigantic agglomeration of this particular set of values that had been institutionalized into the most impactful pipeline of information probably in human history.
And just briefly, you mentioned Catherine Mayer, who is now head of NPR, who was, you said, head of Wikipedia. I'm not very familiar with her. I've seen her on TV. She's fairly young. How did she get to be head of Wikipedia? And I assume in her 30s or late 20s, something like that?
Yeah, she was probably a bit older than that. I'm guessing by then she was in her late 30s.
Okay.
She had come from the NGO land, I would say. She was, if you go back and read her, she did this election monitoring NGO. It was her first project sort of after college in Lebanon. So she was doing election monitoring in Lebanon must have been the early 2000s or late 90s, something like that. And in the bio there for that organization, she actually openly talks about how she truly believes in George Soros's open society vision, like his political philosophy. She's a I believe a true believer in Soros. I don't think she's a bad person. I just think that's how she thinks about the world. Comes up through this sort of web of those kinds of NGOs and ends up at Wikipedia as a chief communications officer.
Mm-hmm.
At that moment, there's a huge scandal at Wikipedia. This would have been in 2015 and 16, where again, this all sort of comes back to the Google stuff. Someone at Wikipedia had this quote unquote genius idea that they're going to create their own search engine. They even called it the Google killer, but they didn't tell anyone about this in the community. And that's the big no no. It's all supposed to be transparency at Wikipedia. And the community found out and they were enraged. And I'm sure Google was extremely upset about this happening. This is the last thing Google wanted after supporting Wikipedia for so long.
Mm-hmm.
And the executive director was given the boot. Catherine Maher, at that time, the communications officer, steps up and becomes interim executive director. And this is where she says, "Okay, we gotta like do a 180 here." The first thing she does is orders a publicity audit. She wants to know, how is the media portraying Wikipedia, and the person who does this for her is their PR agency. That's an agency called Manassan Media, run by Craig Manassian, who at that same time was the chief marketing officer at Clinton Global Initiative. Same, he was a full-time employee of the Clintons doing this for Wikipedia. He's the one that comes back and says, we need to orient towards openness and we need to, create a new strategy. And that's the strategy that became the movement strategy.
Okay. So Google and Wikipedia end up in a very tight, powerful alliance, and it's clearly left of center, maybe more than that. It's a kind of symbiosis. And NPR is aligned with that as well, we can figure, since Catherine Mayer is over at NPR. So they're utilizing that information stream and as reliable. And then this is an important thing you've talked about. We think, okay, well, you can avoid that because I'll just use artificial intelligence, except that where's artificial intelligence drawing its information from? And a lot of it is from Wikipedia, Google, those sources, right?
Yeah, there's a Wikipedia is great training data for AI because it's considered high quality, it's highly structured, um, and it's there's just a lot of it. It's all good qualities for AI training data. So it does pull directly as a reference. Like if you ask ChatGPT a question about something, it'll often pull from Wikipedia. So it's reference data, and then the training data, which like says this is how the world looks, and this is how these are the ways we talk about these things, think about these things. So it's the worldview we've been talking about, the gasp worldview of Wikipedia gets imported into AI in that way. It's not totally one to one, but Wikipedia has a disproportionate impact on most AI training data to the extent that we know.
And by the way, I guess I ask, are all AI platforms created equal? I mean, are some better than others in terms of not utilizing this stuff? From Claude to Grokpedia to ChatGPT to Perplexity, there's more than I can keep track of.
Um, Hard to know. Perplexity relies less on Wikipedia than the others that I do know.
Uh-huh.
Um, a lot of them also train on Reddit, which I would say there's just as many
That's
problems with Reddit
problematic
as
too, right?
Wikipedia.
Yeah. How about Al Jazeera?
Same.
Al Jazeera, now just so people understand, I think that everybody listening probably does. Al Jazeera that's media platforms owned and operated by the Qatari rulers who are Muslim Brotherhood supporters. And does Wikipedia, does Google, NPR, they all? My impression is that they all look on Al Jazeera as a very reliable news source, which it is not. As a
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, they do. Yes, Wikipedia runs on this sort of, you can think about it as like this epistemological backbone. The spine of Wikipedia is this list of sources called reliable sources, and they'll list what sources Wikipedia considers reliable and which it does not. And New York Times, big surprise. The entire mainstream media is all considered, they color code it green and red. So green for reliable, it's the mainstream media. A lot of conservative media disproportionately seems to be red, unreliable. But Al Jazeera is green. It's considered
Al
generally
Jazeera is
reliable.
green, but Fox
Yeah,
News, Washington
it's
Times,
red.
National Review, I bet they're all considered red and unreliable. Am I right?
That's right.
Wall
And
Street
a lot
Journal?
of other, Wall Street Journal, I think, gets a bit of a mixed
Right.
review. Like some portions,
Actually,
they create these.
and it's an unfair question in this sense, in that the commentary section, the opinion section of the Wall Street Journal is clearly right of center, but the news sections actually are not. They're left of center, I would say.
Yes,
Not that
right.
different
So
from
I think their news. I think they do kind of give the news the green, and they have these carve outs. They do this, they do carve outs for like the Telegraph here in London, where the Telegraph is green. It's considered good, except on trans issues, because Wikipedia doesn't like their take on trans issues. So they're just going to carve that out. You can't use it to talk about trans issues. So that means if they come out with a news story about something related to trans stuff, it can't be used as a citation in a Wikipedia entry about that topic. So you look at conservative stuff. It's not just that they're unreliable. Some of them are actually quite a few of them are what they call deprecated, means you can never use it. Like it's an automatic rejection. You can't even debate it. So you also have like China Daily
well,
and Xinhua, which are
yeah. Well,
they're state-owned, state-run Chinese propaganda outlets
yeah.
that are color-coded yellow for sometimes reliable, which is better rating than a lot of the conservative media. So, uh, you know, not it's shocking without being surprising in a way, but that's how the site actually runs, because it's like, what can you cite? It's the outlets that say the things that Wikipedia's worldview finds acceptable.
And my guess is, of course, you mentioned the Chinese. They're they're very savvy about this sort of thing. They know how to feed into this environment and get into Wikipedia, get into Google, get into whatever, get into your head. TikTok, of course, is the most obvious example of that, the most successful example of their propaganda, getting to hundreds of millions of people every day. And it's not clear to me that even though a law was passed that the Chinese Communist Party can't control TikTok, I'm not yet convinced that's actually going to come about. As long as the algorithm is controlled by the Communist Party, they will still control TikTok. That's for another day. You disclosed your undisclosed that you're in London. What about the BBC? The BBC has been just dreadful on a lot of Middle East issues, really indistinguishable from Al Jazeera. But I guess I don't know. Tell me what you want about the BBC.
Yeah, the BBC has a real problem. It's a problem that I think British Jews have been paying attention to quite a long time, but I think the problem is gone much bigger than that. The thing that I think really was a turning point recently, because there's always been bias or allegations of bias about BBC. They don't refer to Hamas as terrorists. There have been, former BBC directors, or very, very senior people have written very scathing reports about BBC bias against Israel and Jews. But what really, I think, might be I wouldn't call it a straw, it's like a gigantic redwood log that broke the camel's back, is when they were caught falsely editing a Trump speech
Mm.
regarding or from January 6th to make it sound like he was saying go out there and get them, where he was saying the exact opposite, but they used this very clever little editing trick. Then there's an internal report into how that editing, that misediting, and that sort of fabrication had happened. They quashed the internal report. They tried to stifle it and prevent anyone from getting hold of it, and it was leaked. So you have a cover-up attempt on something that directly affected an American election, concerning the president of the United States directly, where he was manipulated by BBC editors to be appearing to say something he didn't say. And now we have Donald Trump, who has now found out about this and is, I think, either threatening to sue the BBC for a few $1 billion, or is actually in the process of doing so. So this is going to be a watershed for the BBC. You can mess with a lot of people, even if you're the BBC, but when you're messing with not just an American president, but this particular American president, I think you're in trouble.
And you mentioned that BBC doesn't identify, for example, Hamas as terrorist. My guess is that Wikipedia doesn't like to do that either. Even though terrorism has a specific definition, it's violence inflicted on civilians for political purposes. It's not really ambiguous. If you do that on Al Jazeera, the BBC, Google, Wikipedia, Reddit, etc. Eventually, you get to the point where you're promoting pro-Hamas propaganda, which is anti-Israel, which means anti-Zionist, which means anti-Semitic and Jew hatred, I would say. And if you're doing this from all these different platforms, it's what I think communicologists would call swarming. Swarming, if you want to convince somebody of something, and they need, it's useful if they hear it from many different sources. All the media that gets into their ears, maybe their friends, and pretty soon that's what they believe. Now there are people who can be more critical than that, but there are many people, millions of people, most people who are not. They're going to be, if they're swarmed, that's what they'll believe.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Just a few other things. Well, then I'll let you go. This is all fascinating, though. You do something called, you're involved with something called pirate wires, which I'm only slightly familiar with. Tell people what that is, so that, because I know you contribute to it, and they should know about it.
I'm a sort of contributing editor. I was a senior editor there last year. It's where I did a lot of my original reporting on Wikipedia, on Reddit as well, among many other things, on Blue Sky. Um, great. It's a great outlet. I think people, Mike Solana runs it. He's a great editor. Um, so a valuable resource, and I think some of my reporting is still there, is worth checking out, if I don't say so myself. And in the meantime, I'm now full-time running NPOV and building out this kind of new, as we discussed before, this new approach to investigating online influence campaigns and networks that are doing this kind of coordinated activity.
Just so I don't forget, tell people how to access Pirate Wires, NPOV, your commentary. I know it's on X, Twitter, whatever you call it. Just for people who want to follow up on this.
Sure. Um, Pirate Wires, piratewires.com, like it sounds.
Simple enough.
And NPOV is we're at neutralpov.com. Or you can find me on X, Ashley Rindsberg, and all the information is there as well. Also on Instagram, on Facebook, whatever deep, dark, ominous social media platform you prefer, we are there.
What you're talking about, it seems to me, hugely important to anybody who's trying to understand what's going on in the world. Any people who are consuming news, people who want to know the truth about things. I know you've been on podcasts. Have any major media interviewed you to learn what you know and convey that to their listeners, readers, viewers?
Um, there's a lot of interest, I would say, in independent media. So, I've just did a piece recently for the Free Press about the Iranian stuff. Um, I do some really great podcasts. John Stossel had me on, which, he's got 2 million people watching his show. Dave Rubin, I did recently. And just I'd say a really big and growing awareness inside of independent media. Inside traditional media, very much less so. I think they have, NPR actually did a story about that was partially about me, and they framed this as like the right wing is coming for Wikipedia. They call it like the culture wars or something like that.
Mhm.
But they want to box it out, and I believe that Wikimedia Foundation is probably pushing that narrative that this is just some sort of attack where I'm okay with that personally. I don't mind. It's just that what it does, it creates blinders for them, so they're not really seeing what's going on. They're not actually looking and paying attention. So, you know, if they come calling, I'm happy to answer the call and to talk to anyone and everyone. But
Well, it's important
so
that you
far,
get this information gets out there, that people start to think about it and understand what's going on. I don't know. I mean, you probably thought of this legislatively. I'm not sure anything can be done. I'm not sure you don't just make it worse by trying. Every time the government's gotten into the information business, it hasn't worked out well.
yeah, I think the one caveat there, the one little asterisk, is where we have evidence of foreign influence. I
Right.
think that we're starting to get into a different territory because it's foreign
Yeah,
influence, it should be registered. And
yeah,
also because Wikimedia Foundation is a 501c3. You know, they
yeah,
get to receive revenue tax free at the pleasure of the United States, assuming that they are out there to benefit society. And I think generally that's what Wikimedia Foundation believes it's doing. But the moment you have foreign influence that is leveraging that, and the site has knowledge and is not taking adequate action, I think you really do have a problem.
yeah. And I believe Al Jazeera it was instructed to register as a foreign agent and simply has ignored that. And I think the uh, the rulers of Qatar just figure we got enough friends in high places. We don't really need to worry about this sort of thing.
Yeah, it's like if you can own the chrome covered Lamborghini, you don't mind driving at 150 miles an hour on the freeway because just pay the ticket.
Well said. Any other important points that I didn't tease out that you want to get across to anybody listening?
Um, I think this is all moving really fast, and we are starting to see this stuff bubble up all over the place. I think for the last 2 years, especially Israel and Gaza, it was overwhelming. To your
Yeah.
to your point about a swarm, I mean, it was probably the biggest propaganda swarm, uh, or at least one of them of the 21st century. Um, but I think we're starting to catch up to this on our side of it in terms of reporting, investigation, looking to see what's actually going on, trying to put a better framework around these things that are very disorienting because they hit you in the face over and over and over and over and over. The most outrageous and extreme claims that are being made and repeated. And it's this crazy echo effect in your side of your head, this reverberation. So for people to be able to see, okay, there's actually is more to the story here, and it's what we're seeing is not organic in so many of these cases. It's being directed, it's being guided, it's cooked up. So I would say to people on this note, you know try to learn about it in whatever way you can, and sometimes that's reading an article or two, sometimes it's saying, like, how did the Soviets do this back in the day? What were the Russians doing back in the day? What are the Chinese doing? Like, how does it work? And what have the Americans done for that matter? So learn about it and look into it, and just don't believe what you see.
Ashley Rindsberg, thank you for the work you're doing. It's a service to all of us. It really is.
Thank you,
We
Cliff.
appreciate it. And thanks for coming on the program today to talk about it with us. And thanks to all
Thanks
of
for having
you
me.
bet. And thanks to all of you who have been with us today for this conversation here on Foreign Policy.